Then in 1217, there was another crusade, this time led by King Andrew II of Hungary and Duke Leopold VI of Austria, with the same goal in mind: to take over Jerusalem. The Crusaders successfully captured the city of Damietta in 1219, but they could not advance further into Egypt. After a series of setbacks, including capture and imprisonment of many Crusaders, the Christian forces were forced to abandon their campaign in Egypt. The Crusaders eventually agreed to a treaty with the Muslim forces, allowing them to leave Egypt unharmed, but without achieving their ultimate goal. Genghis Khan wasn't done though. In 1219, went to war against the Khwarezm Empire in present-day Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. During his raids, the Mongol hordes swept through one city after another, taking over the likes of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench. Skilled workers such as carpenters and jewelers were usually saved, while aristocrats and resisting soldiers were killed. Unskilled workers, meanwhile, were often used as human shields during the next assault. No one knows with any certainty how many people died during Genghis Khan's wars, in part because the Mongols propagated their vicious image as a way of spreading terror. At Genghis Khan's death, he controlled a massive territory from the Sea of Japan to the Caspian Sea. However, even more impressively, around 8% of the men in South Asia descend from Genghis Khan today. In 1228, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire tried to conquer the Holy Land, but failed, ending the Sixth Crusade. Of course, the Holy Roman Empire couldn't be the only one crusading. King Louis IX of France in 1248 decided to start the Seventh Crusade to retake Jerusalem, but he was taken prisoner by the Muslims and forced to pay a hefty ransom as he retreated. However, that didn't deter King Louis IX, because in 1270 he was at it again, trying to free Jerusalem from the grips of Muslim rule, but this time he died of dysentery. Once King Louis IX died, his troops retreated, creating the eighth and final time there was a crusade. In England, though, in 1295, England was making a diplomatic headway. In a letter summoning Parliament, King Edward I wrote, "Since a most righteous law of the emperors ordains that what touches all should be approved by all, so it appears that common dangers should be met by remedies agreed upon in common. As King Edward, I would then request 1/10 of the incomes of nobles and 1/11 of the income of knights, creating one of the first parliaments we would see in the New Age." While down in Africa, a leader of extravagant wealth, Mansa Musa, was gaining power. On his famous Hajj, a religious Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim should make at least once in his life, Mansa Musa, with his caravan of camels and an army of scholars, gave vast amounts of gold to any poor person he saw, hence crashing all of the economies in northern Africa due to the inflation of gold. When Mansa Musa returned to Mali, he made it his life purpose to make Timbuktu the Muslim capital of knowledge. So Mansa Musa invested heavily in building the University of Sankore. Various Islamic faith scholars quickly made their way to Sankore to study Islamic theology, law, and literature with over 1 million manuscripts. Mansa Musa was also a very religious man with a policy that he commissioned a new mosque every Friday. However, sadly though, only the Djinguereber Mosque in Timbuktu stood the test of time. In the Americas though, another built on riches was being created. As Aztec legend has it, the god Huitzilopochtli directed them to build where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, eating a snake. When they saw this exact scene on an island located in what was once Lake Texcoco, they interpreted it as a sign from their god, and founded Tenochtitlan on that island. As time passed, Tenochtitlan started to build impressive temples such as the Great Temple. The Great Temple comprised of 2 main structures, dedicated to the gods Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The city itself was most fascinating. It was designed with a complex system of canals and causeways to help control flooding and facilitate transport across the city, while they started to farm on floating gardens known as chinampas on the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco, which were used to grow crops such as maize, beans, and squash. As Mali and the Aztecs were building their cities, England and France were in war for 100 years. The origins of the conflict lay with the status of the Duchy of Guyenne. In basic capitalistic terms, this was owned by the British Crown. However, the land itself was in France. The second reason was that the last direct descendant of Charlemagne, King Charles IV, died in 1328. So the next closest relative was Edward III, the King of England. So King Edward III claimed the rule of France in 1337, which was not liked by the French people. As the petty, erratic 100 Years' War raged on, the people of the world had to face a pandemic like no other, the bubonic plague. As the Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio wrote, at the beginning of the malady, certain swellings either on the groin or under the armpits waxed to the bigness of a common apple, others to the size of an egg, some more and some less, and these the vulgar named plague boils. Historians believe this pandemic was spread by rats traveling through ships across Europe and merchants throughout the Silk Road. No matter how this plague was produced, around 75 to 200 million people died. With the death of so many people, especially the poor, landowners and nobles were required to allow farmers to keep more of the product they farmed, leading to more workers' rights. In China, though, a group of rebels known as the Red Turbans revolted against the Mongol rulers of China. The Red Turbans were led by a man named Zhu Yanzhong, born into a poor peasant family. Zhu built a strong following among the rebel forces, and eventually emerged as their leader. In 1368, Zhu declared himself emperor and established the Ming dynasty, marking the beginning of a new era in Chinese history. In 1428, at the age of 16, Joan left her home in the village of Domremy and traveled to the court of Charles VII, where she asked for permission to lead the French army against the English. At first, her request was met with skepticism and disbelief. Still, Joan persisted and eventually won the support of the French commanders. Joan's first major military victory came in the Siege of Orleans in 1429. She led the French troops in a series of daring attacks on the English forces, and she broke the siege and liberated the city. This victory boosted French morale and helped to turn the tide of the war in their favor. Over the next several months, Joan led the French army to victories against the English, including the Battle of Patay in June 1429. However, her success also made her enemies in the English and French court. In 1430, she was captured by the English and put on trial for heresy and witchcraft. Joan was subjected to a grueling trial. She was accused of various crimes, including dressing in men's clothing, practicing sorcery, and hearing voices. Despite the odds against her, Joan remained steadfast in her faith and her belief that she was carrying out God's will. In the end, Joan was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning at stake. She was executed on May 30th, 1431 at 19. Then, 20 years later, in the Battle of Castilian, Charles VII of France led a French army which defeated the English army, effectively ending English territorial claims in France. While back in the great city of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire was declining, weakened by years of war, political instability, and economic turmoil. In contrast, the Ottoman Empire, led by Sultan Mehmed II, was on the rise. And the Sultan saw an opportunity to expand his empire and gain control of the strategic city of Constantinople. By 1453, Mehmed II led an army of 80,000 soldiers, including elite Janissary troops and a powerful artillery force, to besiege Constantinople. The Byzantine defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI, were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. They faced a seemingly impossible task to hold off the Ottoman assault. The Ottomans bombarded the city with artillery for nearly 2 months, causing extensive damage to the walls and fortifications. The Byzantine defenders, meanwhile, struggled to maintain morale and keep their troops fed and supplied. Then, on the fateful day, May 29, 1453, the Ottomans launched a massive assault on the city. Climbing up, covered by siege towers, they were able to breach the walls and gain access to the city. Despite putting up a valiant defense, the Byzantine defenders were overwhelmed, and the Ottomans were able to storm the city and capture the capital, causing the great Byzantine Empire to fall. In 1453, all paths no longer led to Rome, and all traces back to the Empire of Caesar were erased. It was replaced by the beginning of utter Ottoman domination in the region. ushering in a new era of Turkish power and influence in the Mediterranean. While the Byzantines might have been falling, the Russians were finally gaining their independence. At the time, the Mongol Empire was ruling over Russia, demanding that various Russian towns pay tribute or face the wrath of the Mongols. However, in 1472, Ivan the Great refused to pay such tribute. Over the next several years, he built up his military strength and was able to drive out the Mongol garrisons from various cities and towns throughout Russia. In 1480, the Mongols demanded that Ivan pay tribute or face military action, but after a tense standoff, they finally retreated. Ivan's victory was the beginning of a free Russia and the decline of the Mongolian Empire. Then in 1492, as Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the Europeans discovered the New World. Set initially on finding a path to India, instead he landed on an island in the Bahamas, which he aptly named San Salvador. When he and his crew set up camp, he met the Lucayans, skilled fishermen and farmers, who welcomed him and his crew and provided them with food and supplies. While back in Europe, a golden age of culture was upon us. In 1503, Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. Da Vinci's biographer, Walter Isaacson, says, "The Mona Lisa, to me, is the greatest emotional painting ever done. The way the smile flickers makes it a work of art and science because Leonardo understood optics, the muscles of the lips, and how light strikes the eye. All of it goes into making the Mona Lisa's smile so mysterious and elusive." In 1504, Michelangelo sculpted David. Michelangelo would say, "In every block of marble, I see a statue as plain as though it stood before me, shaped and perfect in attitude and action. I have only to hew away the rough walls that imprison the lovely apparition to reveal it to the other eyes as mine see it." While in 1506, Michelangelo was painting the magnificent painting of the Sistine Chapel. While in the political world, Niccolo Machiavelli is one of, if not the most influential, pieces of literature we have today. The Prince is a political manifesto that comments on the past civilizations we've heard about in this video. Machiavelli writes, "It is much safer to be feared than loved, because love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment which never fails." Think about the ordinary farmer. Think about the man who spends generations of their life farming, giving heavy taxes to a noble lord for doing nothing except protecting them. Why won't the farmers rebel? It's because they're afraid of what would happen without their leaders. Without the elites, the Huns or the Mongols can come to your farm and destroy you on their own. So you live in fear as to what might happen to you, leaving you to give your wheat to said leader. Martin Luther, though, didn't just report on the basics of human nature. Martin wanted to make a difference and was sick of the Catholic Church. At the time, the Catholic Church was selling indulgences, which were certificates that people could purchase to reduce the amount of time they would spend in purgatory after they died. Luther believed this practice was corrupt and went against the Bible's teachings, which emphasized the importance of repentance and faith over material wealth. In protest, he wrote a series of 95 theses, or arguments, challenging the Church's authority and calling for reform. On October 31st, 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, which was a common way of announcing a public debate or discussion. Luther's 95 Theses sparked a debate within the church and among European scholars and theologians. Some people agreed with his criticisms of the church, while others saw him as a heretic and a threat to the established order. The beginning of Protestantism was upon us. In 1519, though, the Spanish conquistadors, under the leadership of Hernan Cortés, arrived on the Aztec shores. They were greeted by the Aztecs, who gave gifts of gold and silver of incredible wealth to the Spanish, as they believed that the Spaniards were emissaries of the god Quetzalcoatl. However, Cortés soon revealed his true intentions: to conquer the Aztec Empire and claim its wealth for Spain. Over several years, Cortés and his forces engaged in a series of battles with the Aztecs, marked by intense violence and brutality. The Spanish were aided by their superior military technology, including guns and cannons, and by the support of indigenous allies, who were the enemies of the Aztecs. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Cortés and his men made significant gains against the Aztecs, eventually laying siege to their capital city of Tenochtitlan. After months of fighting, the city fell to the Spanish in 1521, and the Aztec Empire was effectively destroyed. Then, following the strategy of Cortés, Francisco Pizarro led an expedition that conquered the Incan Empire in present-day Peru. Though the violence was authoritarian, the biohazards were even more demanding. The Europeans, due to having survived illnesses such as the bubonic plague and smallpox, developed immunity to many of these diseases that they've, one way or another, spread to the native people, essentially over time, killing them off. Under Suleiman the Magnificent's leadership, the Ottoman Empire became one of the most powerful and influential empires in world history. Suleiman was a brilliant strategist and military leader, and his reign was marked by significant conquests and political achievements. Like many other leaders, he set out to conquer the world. By the end of his reign, Suleiman the Magnificent presided over a vast empire that stretched from southeastern Europe to the deserts of Arabia and from the shores of the Mediterranean to the plains of Persia. His conquests included the capture of Belgrade and Budapest in Europe, Jerusalem and Mecca in the Middle East, and Tabriz and Baghdad in Persia. The Ottomans also became the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean, with control over North African cities such as Algiers and Tunis, creating the dominant Ottoman civilization. But yet, all things fall when one is in love. And the murder-happy King Henry had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn and was desperate to marry her. However, Catherine of Aragon was still alive, and the Catholic Church did not recognize divorce. Henry's solution was to break away from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England, with himself as the head. In 1534, Henry passed the Act of Supremacy, which declared that the king, not the Pope, was the supreme head of the Church of England, leaving the Catholic Church to be angry and excommunicate Henry VII, leaving a schism between the Church of England and the Catholic Church even today. Ivan the Terrible is now the ruler of Russia. In the early years of his reign, Ivan enjoyed significant success, launching military campaigns against neighboring kingdoms and expanding Russia's borders. He also oversaw the construction of magnificent public works, including St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. However, as Ivan grew older, he became increasingly paranoid and erratic. He launched a series of brutal purges and executions, targeting anyone he perceived as threatening his power. He also had a volatile temper, lashing out at advisors and nobles who dared to question his decisions. In 1560, Ivan suffered a devastating personal loss when his beloved wife Anastasia died. This event seems to have triggered a significant psychological breakdown, and Ivan became increasingly unstable and violent. He launched a series of bloody campaigns against his own people, including the notorious Oprichnina, a campaign of terror and repression that killed thousands of Russians and destroyed countless homes and families, truly deserving of the name Terrible. While Russia was going through that, England was on the rise with the start of the English Renaissance under the leadership of Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabethan playwrights dominated the scene, creating written words that were poetic in language and poignant in meaning. They've even written plays about people we've already talked about. William Shakespeare wrote many plays, including Histories, Julius Caesar, which was about the assassination of Julius Caesar, King John, which was about the 100 Years' War, and Henry VII was a play about showing human needs to gain power. Other notable playwrights who filled the scene were Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and John Webster. While on the other side of the world, the English colony of Jamestown was forming in Virginia, under the Virginia Trading Company. Slightly up north, Samuel de Champlain was establishing the French colony of Quebec in Canada. While back in the Old World, they were having a new era of fighting, the 30 Years' War. This time, it was between the Protestants and the Catholics. It began in 1618 when the Holy Roman Emperor attempted to impose Catholicism on the Protestant population of Bohemia. The Bohemians rebelled, and soon the conflict spread throughout the region. Over the next 30 years, armies marched and countermarched across Europe, leaving a trail of destruction and devastation. The war was characterized by brutal sieges, bloody battles, and atrocities committed by both sides. At its height, the war involved most of the major powers of Europe, including France, Spain, Sweden, and the Holy Roman Empire. It was fought along religious, political, and economic lines, with each side vying for dominance and control. The war finally ended in 1648 with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia. The treaty recognized the Dutch Republic's independence, established the individual state's sovereignty within the Holy Roman Empire, and ended the religious conflicts that fueled the war. While in China, the Ming court was plagued by corruption, factionalism, and economic decline. The emperor at the time, Chongzhen, faced mounting pressure from his advisors to strengthen the military and defend against the Manchu threat. However, his efforts were hindered by infighting among officials and a lack of resources. In 1644, the Manchu army, led by Prince Dorgon, launched a massive invasion of China. The Ming army, weakened by years of neglect and corruption, was no match for the highly disciplined and skilled Manchu forces. The Manchus quickly conquered Beijing and installed their puppet emperor, ending the Ming dynasty, continuing the cycle of dynasties in China. While in Spain, King Charles II died without having any heirs, creating a real political crisis of who should be the leader. King Louis XIV of France supported his grandson, Philip, as the rightful heir to the Spanish throne, hoping to secure French influence over Spain and its territories. On the other hand, Emperor Leopold I of Austria supported the candidacy of Archduke Charles, a member of the Habsburg dynasty, who was seen as a potential ally against French expansionism. The conflict soon escalated into a major war, with many European powers taking sides and forming alliances. The principal belligerents were France and Spain against a coalition of Austria, Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, and several other minor powers. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which recognized Philip as King of Spain, but required him to renounce any claims to the French throne and cede some territories to Great Britain and Austria. The Treaty of Rastatt, signed the following year, officially ended the war. In 1707, the Acts of the Union were passed by the Parliaments of England and Scotland, which united the two kingdoms into a single political entity known as Great Britain, hence creating the legal foothold that is Great Britain. However, Scotland took a disliking to this. There were protests and uprisings in the years following the Union, including the Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745, which aimed to restore the Scottish monarchy and independence. Then, on July 4th, 1776, a group of American patriots stood in a room in Philadelphia, signing a document that would say the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." War in the Americas was on. But back in Europe, the tone was quite different. Adam Smith published the famous book, The Wealth of Nations, The Foundations of Laissez-faire Economics, which essentially says the market would balance itself out over time. In Austria, Mozart was performing his magnum opus, the Hafner Serenade. Mozart's Hafner Serenade is a charming and elegant work featuring courtly dance music and light, lyrical melodies. Its graceful melodies, subtle harmonies, and elegant instrumental writing characterize it. As the war continued, King George III sent his armies of the masses over to America. Though the colonists had little military training, their knowledge of the terrain and guerrilla tactics made them nearly invisible. At the same time, the Red Army coats were easy to see for the Americans. In the summer of 1781, George Washington and French General Rochambeau marched their forces south to Virginia, where they laid siege to Cornwallis and his army at Yorktown. The British were trapped and could not escape by land or sea. The siege dragged on for weeks. The American and French forces bombarded the British with artillery. They dug trenches to inch their way closer to the British defenses. The French Navy defeated the British Navy in a crucial naval battle off the coast of Virginia, cutting off Cornwallis's only escape route by sea. On October 14, 1781, the American and French forces launched a massive assault on the British defenses. The British fought valiantly, but were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, and they soon began to falter. On October 19th, Cornwallis surrendered his army to Washington, effectively ending the war. The victory at Yorktown was a decisive moment in the war, and it marked the end of British rule in America and the beginning of a new experiment. With America finally being free from the totally tyrannical grips of Britain, they had one issue. How were they going to lead? Were they going to make General George Washington their monarch? Therefore, democracy was chosen. However, Plato made a good point many years ago, that the common man was incapable and not wise enough to pick a better leader to lead them to success. So the American-founded Constitutional Convention came up with this idea of the Electoral College, where the common man would vote for a particular person who would then have a say in who could be president. So instead of the president being directly voted on by the people, they would vote on elites, who would then vote for the president directly. The French then noticed how well the American Revolution went. At the time, the French were ruled by King Louis XVI and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. As Queen Marie Antoinette told the peasants, "Let them eat cake," the people of France got together. They decided they wanted more say in how the country was run, and they formed a group called the National Assembly and started making new laws to give them more rights. One of the most famous events of the French Revolution was the storming of the Bastille. This was a prison that represented the king's power, and the people wanted to show that they were not afraid of him. They broke into the prison and freed the prisoners, which started a revolution throughout France. Many influential people lost their heads during the revolution, including King Louis XVI and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. The people were tired of being ruled by a king and queen who didn't care about them, and they wanted to create a new system where everyone would have a say. And the people of France voted in Maximilien Robespierre. In 1789, Robespierre was elected as a delegate to the Estates General, which was convened to address France's financial crisis. He quickly emerged as a leading voice in the National Assembly, advocating for the ordinary people's rights and opposing the aristocracy's power. As the revolution continued, though, Robespierre became increasingly radical in his views, advocating for the execution of King Louis XVI and the establishment of a republic. He was elected to the powerful Committee of Public Safety in 1793, tasked with protecting the revolution and rooting out enemies of the state. Under Robespierre's leadership, the committee launched a period of intense repression known as the Reign of Terror. Thousands of people were arrested, tried, and executed for crimes against the revolution. Robespierre became known as a ruthless and uncompromising figure. However, Robespierre's power began to wane as the people grew tired of the violence and the instability of the revolution. In 1794, he was arrested and imprisoned along with his closest allies. On July 28, 1794, Robespierre was taken to the guillotine and executed. The execution marked the end of the Reign of Terror and democracy for now in France. Instead, they moved to a directory. A directory is a government led by a 5-member executive council, known as the Directory, which was chosen by the Council of Elders. This legislative body was also part of the new government. The Directory was meant to serve as a moderating force, balancing the interests of the various factions that had emerged during the revolution. However, the Directory concept wasn't successful as well. So General Napoleon Bonaparte decided to overthrow the government and begin his conquests to take over the world. So off Napoleon went to conquer much of Europe. In 1805, Napoleon defeated a combined Austro-Russian army at the Battle of Austerlitz. solidifying his position as one of Europe's most powerful leaders. He then conquered much of the continent, including Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with a massive army. Still, the campaign proved disastrous, and his forces were decimated by the harsh Russian winter. The defeat marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall. In 1814, the European powers allied against Napoleon and invaded France, forcing him to abdicate his throne and go into exile on the island of Elba. However, he returned to France in 1815 in what became known as the 100 Days, and briefly regained power before being defeated by the British and Prussian armies at the Battle of Waterloo. While back in the Americas, Simón Bolívar was on his military campaigns to free Latin American countries from the grasp of the Spanish colonial rule. Bolívar began his military campaigns in Venezuela in 1810, where he led a successful uprising against the Spanish colonial authorities. He then moved on to Colombia, where he won a series of important victories against the Spanish, including the Battle of Boyacá in 1819, which secured the independence of Colombia. Bolívar then turned his attention to Ecuador and Peru, where he won a series of decisive battles that helped secure both countries' independence. He captured the city of Lima in 1824, effectively ending Spanish control of Peru. Bolívar's final military campaign was in Bolivia, where he led the fight for independence against the Spanish in 1825. Bolivia was named in honor of Bolívar, who played a critical role in its liberation. In 1848, two men had an idea that would spark debate worldwide. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the book called The Communist Manifesto, which is a book about the idea of communism, where instead of a capitalistic system, where the nobles or bourgeois own everything and the workers and proletariats work for slave wages, instead, what if the proletariats owned the means of production and all worked together? As Marx and Engels would write, let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians would have nothing to lose but their chains, and they have, and they'd to win. They would also write, the need for a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. Right after the writing of the Communist Manifesto began a period in Europe known as the Scramble for Africa. It all began in the 1870s when European countries began to explore the interior of Africa, looking for new territories to claim and resources to exploit. At first, the European powers were cautious, sending explorers and missionaries into Africa to establish trade networks and alliances with local leaders. However, as competition increased, the European powers became more aggressive in their tactics. They used military force to establish colonies and protectorates, and they engaged in diplomatic maneuvering and propaganda campaigns to gain the support of local populations. One of the most ruthless tactics the European powers used was dividing Africa into artificial borders and creating new ethnic and linguistic divisions. This created tensions and conflicts between different African groups, which the Europeans used to their advantage, creating a European stronghold over the continent of Africa to increase their profits. The scramble for Africa came to an end as a result of several factors, including changing international politics, economic realities, and rising African nationalism. One of the key factors that contributed to the end of the scramble for Africa was the changing balance of power in Europe. By the early 20th century, European powers were increasingly focused on competition with each other, particularly in Europe itself, and were less interested in acquiring new colonies in Africa. This was due in part to the growing tensions between European powers that would eventually lead to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Because on June 28, 1914, a shot was heard around the world with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his assassination by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip sparked a diplomatic crisis that quickly escalated into a global conflict. In the aftermath of the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, triggering a complex web of alliances and treaties that drew other countries into the conflict. Germany, an ally of Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia and France, while Great Britain, which had a treaty with Belgium, declared war on Germany. Within weeks, most of Europe was embroiled in a brutal and devastating conflict. In November 1918, after 4 years of brutal fighting, the Allied powers and the Central Powers agreed to an armistice, effectively bringing an end to the war and the demise of the Ottoman Empire. On November 11th, the armistice went into effect, and the guns fell silent across Europe. World War II. The peace was short-lived because a man named Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. Like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Trajan, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Suleiman the Great, Adolf Hitler wanted to establish an empire for his nation and his people. Adolf had dreams of building an empire larger than anything that was ever created. He wanted to make the Roman Empire look like nothing. However, for the sake of the world, and especially those Hitler viewed as undesirable vermin, in April 1945, Soviet forces began a massive assault on Berlin. After weeks of intense fighting, the city fell on May 2nd, and German forces surrendered. Meanwhile, Allied forces were closing in from the west, and on May 7th, Germany signed an unconditional surrender, officially ending the war in Europe. A few months later, after the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan surrendered as well, leaving the war to be over. From World War II on, the world has faced a technological revolution. With Alan Turing's invention of the computer during the war, the world became global. For 50 years, America and the Soviet Union were at war, despite the fact that they were on two totally different continents. In 1969, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, saying,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
As the years on the world has become increasingly smaller, computers have become more affordable. Cell phones changed the way we communicated with one another. Let's go back to the story of a man named Gilgamesh on his quest for immortality. At the end of the poem, Gilgamesh realizes, life, which you look for, you will never find. For when gods created man, they let death be his share, and life withheld in their own hands. The history of human civilizations is an incomplete book, constantly being updated. Some things will never change. However, humans will always die. Empires will always rise and fall. The masses will always clamor towards safety.